The most elusive holy relic of all time. Was it the chalice Jesus used to celebrate the Last Supper? Was it a magic vessel found again in Arthurian times? From the Holy Land to pagan Britain to the New World, In Search Of has tracked this mystery. What was the Holy Grail? Modern films and novels still celebrate King Arthur and the Knights of the Round Table. Jousting, questing, bringing chivalry to medieval England. At the heart of the Arthur stories was a mystery, a strange, otherworldly quest for the long-lost Holy Grail. There are 47 surviving romances of King Arthur and the quest for the Holy Grail. Arthur was a real person. In the 5th century, he led the Britons to a decisive victory over the Saxons. The Grail legends, however, are not history, but a very strange intertwining of Christian and pagan stories. For the first time on In Search Of, we're going to examine the same mystery twice. First, as a Christian legend, and second, as a very ancient pagan myth. The image of the Last Supper derives from medieval art. The events are chronicled in the Gospels. Jerusalem, 33 AD. 13 humble Jews gathered to celebrate Passover, a ritual unchanged since the time of Moses. Their rabbi, Jesus, astounded the group with his blessing of the ritual wine. Drink. This is my blood, spilled for the redemption of sin. We will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until we all meet in heaven. A day later, Jesus was dying on the cross. According to legend, Joseph of Arimathea attended the crucifixion. He anointed with Christ's blood the same silver chalice, which thus became the Holy Grail. Joseph of Arimathea fled Roman persecution to England. Landing at St. Michael's Mount, he took the Holy Grail as a talisman to found the first Christian church in the British Isles. The story then took a curious turn. The Holy Grail was somehow lost. 500 years later, the legend continued with the birth of King Arthur. On the wind-swept rocky Cornish coast, beneath the ruins of the great castle of Tintagel, lies Merlin's cave. Around 500 AD, the old magician, deep in thought, left his grotto. Old King Uther Pendragon was dying without an heir, and the future of England seemed in grave doubt. He found an abandoned baby and recognized that this was an auspicious moment. England needed a strong ruler and a common goal. Merlin proclaimed to the skies, "England, behold your king." So the story was told. The baby did grow up to unite all the warring feudal barons. Arthur's Order of the Round Table was the first stirring of democracy in medieval Europe. Late one night, near the end of Arthur's reign, a strange omen appeared deep in Castle Camelot. King David's sword, embedded in a rock. It was foretold that whosoever could pull the sword from the stone would find the lost Holy Grail. All the Knights of the Round Table tried in vain. Even Lancelot, the strongest man in the world, had to admit that force alone was useless. Suddenly, a stranger appeared from the shadows. Galahad, the one pure knight. All the knights wanted to follow Galahad in search of the Holy Grail. They felt it would be the greatest adventure of their lives. "12 knights and an army of attendants left Camelot. Most of them soon wearied of the search for the Grail and took to raiding Saxon castles, slaying infidels, and rescuing maidens in distress. Too worldly to pursue the Grail, they were soon decimated by unlucky battles and spiritual impurity. The few who kept to the true quest found themselves in an appalling wasteland. Lost in a dark forest. They came upon ruins older than any of them could imagine. Their quest became a dark dream, like being lost in a maze. Finally, half dead from wounds and starvation, they came to the enchanted castle of Corbenic, where it was told the Grail itself was hidden. Only 3 knights were left. Sir Percival, who had never known a woman, Sir Bors, who had only once and repented, and Virgin Galahad, whose strength was as the strength of 10 because his heart was pure. They found the castle guarded by the 3 deadly sins. The fallen armor lay empty. Inside the castle, they had to climb 7 levels. Like Robert Bruce and the Spider, 6 times they lost their way, until the 7th attempt to penetrate the ultimate mystery. They found more than they expected. The Grail had been guarded for 500 years by the wounded Fisher King, preserved in a terrible state of agony until the proper magic question would be asked. Galahad alone conquered his terror and asked, "Whom does this Grail serve?" Grail came forth with a light no man could tell, and changed shape in a fashion no man could fathom, and the wasteland was restored to fertility. Galahad then took the Grail back to the Holy Land, to the mythic country of Sarras. What was this Sarras? It was not told. In Antioch, Syria, in 1910, an ancient silver chalice was unearthed beneath 1,000 years of rubble. Scholars traced the progress of the chalice through secret deals to Paris. It was then sold to the Cloisters Museum in New York, where it is now kept under top security. It was recently discovered that the outer cup of gold encloses a fragile inner cup of pure silver. This new evidence led several top historians to pose the question, is the inner chalice, the Holy Grail, found at last? The Antioch chalice, kept in the Cloisters Museum in New York, was for a time thought to be the Holy Grail. Religious historians speculated that the outer gold cage was a reliquary, fabricated to hold and protect the inner silver cup. The chalice is obviously very old and in a fragile state of preservation. The silver is as thin and as delicate as tissue paper. The authenticity of the chalice has been researched by the curator of the Metropolitan Museum, Margaret Fraser.
The great impression that this cup made inspired, and the dating of it in the 1st century, shortly after the death of Christ, conjured up the idea that this was the cup from which Christ drank at the Last Supper. More recently, we have looked at the cup with the eye to the style of the figures, to the way the grapevine is ordered on the cup, and found that there's no way that you can put it in the 1st century. It simply doesn't have the same style as 1st century work. Much more, it responds to works from the 4th, even as late as the 6th century. And is it likely that Christ used the silver cup? It seems highly unlikely. He and his apostles espoused the simple life, the giving to the poor as opposed to the rich. And silver was a very valuable commodity. To make it into tableware was only the privilege of the rich. It's inconceivable to me that Christ had a silver cup. Rather, cups of normal materials that we use, glass, pottery, or wood.
Most scholars now agree, not the Holy Grail. The Church has never officially recognized the Holy Grail as a relic. Many parts of the legends indicate the Grail was not a cup at all, but something much more mysterious. As a Christian legend, the Grail quest is very strangely convoluted. There is, however, a pre-Christian version of the story which takes us back 2,000 years before Christ, a version long lost in the mists of time, until a recent amazing breakthrough. Glastonbury, England, has many links to the old stories. Joseph of Arimathea is said to have hidden the Grail at the bottom of Chalice Well, a natural spring of red-tinged waters. The awesome ruins of Glastonbury Abbey mark the spot where Joseph built the first Christian church in England. King Arthur was supposedly buried here. Many Christian cathedrals are constructed over the sites of ancient pagan temples. Similarly, many Christian legends are retellings of earlier pagan myths. Just as we can excavate under church foundations, is it possible to discover, hidden in the Christian stories, traces of an earlier religion? Jeffrey Ashe is the world's foremost Arthurian scholar. He's published 16 books on the quest of the Holy Grail.
It's usually thought of as the cup or chalice used by Christ at the Last Supper. But if we go back to earlier versions, we find that it seems to be a sort of magical pagan cauldron of plenty, not a Christian thing at all. It doesn't appear alone. It appears with other things, with a lance that drips blood, with a sword, with a dish that sometimes has a severed head on it. These are called the Grail Hallows, and they all add to the mystery.
Is it possible to rediscover the lost pagan story of the Grail? Near Glastonbury Abbey is a very strange mound, 500 feet high and 2,000 feet long. Glastonbury Tor. The most uncanny aspects of this famous landmark are the obviously man-made terraces cut deep into the sides, still visible after 4,000 years of erosion.
Some years ago, an Irishman, Geoffrey Russell, put forward a rather interesting theory that these are the remains of a prehistoric maze which was cut in the hill for some ritual purpose thousands of years ago, and that people used to spiral up it by a long, long, complicated circuit going round 7 times, up and down and round and back. And he suggested that this was the origin of the whole idea of the quest of the Grail, that people came here to thread a maze to some sort of initiation, ritual, mystical experience when they finally got to the centre. I live by the Tor, but I had never really gone into it until a year or so ago. So I spent a very hot afternoon walking round and round the Tor, seeing whether Russell's maze worked, and I thought it did. And I went on trying all through that summer until I was pretty well satisfied that I had the whole pattern. Great satisfaction in finding that it did seem to work. There is one really heartbreaking bit where you very nearly get to the top, but you aren't allowed to go there. You have to go down and make another circuit, and down and make another circuit, and then you are finally allowed to go to the top. I think perhaps this is part of the secret of the whole thing. Perhaps there was a kind of lesson in it.
Is there any other evidence which could corroborate such a radical theory that the quest for the Holy Grail was an ancient pagan ceremony inside a giant maze? The answer? A surprising confirmation. At Tintagel, where legendary Arthur was born, ruins of a Saxon fortress still stand guard over the Cornish coast. Pre-Roman ruins have been found beneath the foundations of the fortress. Ruins which date to the time of the ancient megalith builders in Britain, the time of Stonehenge. In a hidden valley beneath Tintagel, Geoffrey Ashe noticed a rock carving from the same era. As a double maze, this is the Mother Earth symbol of a long-forgotten religion. The same sevenfold spiral has been found in ancient Crete, Pompeii, and as far away as the Hopi Indian lands in America. No one had noticed any similarity between a small circular rock carving and a 2,000-foot-long hill until Ashe obtained aerial photographs of the Glastonbury Tor. At first, he couldn't believe his eyes. He checked and rechecked his diagrams, counting terraces, noting all the turns and convolutions. The Tintagel rock maze leads in, out, and in to the center. The Glastonbury Tor maze, although stretched to fit the original hill, leads up, down, and up to the center. The patterns are exactly the same. When Ashe published his findings, a band of modern-day Druids organized the first threading of the maze in 4,000 years. Strangely, they have been instinctively drawn to repeat again and again this ritual on the Tor. For the first time, we have an insight into an ancient pagan rite. An
archaeological dig could corroborate this theory that the maze on Glastonbury Tor was the original quest for the Holy Grail. If so, the nature of the Grail itself, the prize at the center of the maze, is still open to speculation. From ancient times through the Christian era, modern scholars still regard the Holy Grail as one of the great unsolved mysteries. What was the Holy Grail? In the earliest known accounts, it was described as a saucer-shaped vessel which fell from heaven. The roots of the word Grail mean crater. Were the Christian legends built upon pagan myths, dim memories of something ancient and alien, still buried under Glastonbury Tor? Perhaps.
The Israelites' conquest of the Promised Land has long been an article of faith for Jews and Christians alike. The Bible tells us how, led by Joshua, they crossed the Jordan and tumbled the walls of Jericho with mighty trumpet blasts. In quick succession, the pagan cities of Canaan fell before their righteous assaults. And all the cities of all the kings of them did Joshua take, and smote them with the edge of the sword. And he utterly destroyed them as Moses, the servant of the Lord, commanded. So goes the scriptural account. But today, a number of archaeologists challenge the historical accuracy of that biblical narrative. Their findings suggest that the Canaanite cities may have been destroyed decades before the first Israelite settlements. That they settled peacefully and gradually. And that heresy of heresies, that the Israelites were themselves Canaanite peasants. Is it possible then that the Israelite conquest of the Promised Land simply never happened? When Jesus of Nazareth was spreading the gospel of the New Testament through the Holy Land, these ruins were already 1,000 years old. This is the kingdom of Hatzor, all that remains of a mighty empire that 2 millennia before the birth of Christ reigned in the Middle East. To the ancient world, it was known as the land of Canaan. But to the Hebrews of the Old Testament, it was the Promised Land. Hatzor has lured archaeologist Amnon Ben-Tor in search of clues to an age-old question, rather a series of questions. Who were the Israelites? Where did they come from? Did Joshua lead an army across the Jordan River to conquer Canaan, as the Bible says?
I don't know if there was a Joshua, but I look to find the period described in Joshua. 11th century, 12th century. Somewhere here, this is where they are. These bricks here, that's Canaanite. These stones here, this is Israelite, but of the time of the monarchy. What's missing in here, that's Joshua, or the time of Joshua.
Ben-Tor hopes that the answer may be found here, in the great Canaanite palace at Hatzor.
This is Canaanite Hatzor, the head of all those kingdoms. There's no building like it anywhere in Hatzor, and I don't think in the entire country. It's really big. So, and it lies all under where we are standing. This is Canaanite, look there. This is Ahab, or the 9th century. Over there, that's Solomon, 10th century. Over there, 8th century, the period of the kings. Okay, so Joshua, Judges, Kings, one on top of the other. The only one that is missing is in between. Israelites under Joshua, that's what we are looking for. Up there, those are the Golan Heights. Very controversial, no?
Why?
I thought we were talking about Joshua.
But in Israel, the story of Joshua is never far from present-day controversy. The archaeology at Hatzor, within sight of those embattled heights, has political overtones in a country where historical claim to the land is a matter of war and peace. For it was here that Joshua and the Israelites finished their righteous conquest of the Holy Land, according to the Old Testament. They put to the sword all who were in it, utterly destroying them. There were none left that breathed. And he burned Hatzor with fire.
Look how dark it is, how black it is. Look at all those fallen mud bricks. This is the real end of Hatzor. Look at the ashes, almost 1.5 meters of debris, of ashes, of wooden beams, of pottery, of all kinds of finds, and we are not yet down to the actual floor. So this is going to be a real big thing.
Was it the Israelites who destroyed Hatzor, fulfilling their destiny as foretold in the Bible?
Now, this is Hatzor, and this is the Bible. The question is, do they indeed correlate? Does it really mean that, as it is written in the Bible, this is how it happened? This is still an open question. We don't know. Because it says so in the Bible doesn't necessarily mean that it is wrong, okay? It may very well be so, but it is for us to prove. It may very well be that somebody else destroyed Hatzor, and in the book of Joshua, or whoever wrote the book of Joshua, attributed the story to the Israelites.
For now, the answer remains hidden in the rubble of Hatzor. Amnon ben Tor and his team are continuing their search for the missing chapter from the time of Joshua. Although their efforts are not always rewarded, today they have made a new find.
So it's just like a little scarab. You see the head here, and the wings and everything. Nice, huh?
Very nice. What year? Okay.
This is about 8th century, something like this, 9th century. It's about 2,800 years old, maybe something like this. I don't know, we have to study it.
Young.
We have, very young, yesterday. We have to study it. It's the period of the kings of Israel. Yeah. That's the Israelites, no question. But post Joshua, definitely. Unfortunately, not Joshua.
So Moses commanded, so Joshua did. According to Scripture, the conquest of Canaan was the last act in a drama that began with the triumphant exodus of the Israelites from Egypt. Moses led the 12 tribes of Israel into the wilderness. When they came upon Mount Sinai, Moses went up to the mountain to receive the 10 Commandments. Moses died before reaching the Promised Land. His servant Joshua would lead the Israelites across the Jordan River. At Jericho, the Lord commanded them to march around the city for 6 days. On the 7th, trumpets were sounded, the people shouted, and the walls came crashing down. For over a century, archaeologists have sought to verify the conquest as related in the book of Joshua. Today, a new generation of Israeli archaeologists is challenging the validity of the Old Testament as a historical document. Israel Finkelstein has surveyed hundreds of ancient settlements throughout Israel. He thinks the Battle of Jericho never happened.
The conquest theory in Jericho was really disproved years ago. I think that it's a process of maybe 30 or 50 years of excavations. Excavations in the sites which are mentioned in the Bible in the conquest narrative reveal that either the sites were not at all inhabited at that time, or that the destruction of the Canaanite sites was a gradual and long process which took 150 years. Simply, this was not done by a group of people in 1 year or in several years or in a short period of time.
If Joshua's conquest of Canaan is a myth, then how did the Israelites reach the Promised Land? Over the past decade, Adam Zertal has also uncovered dozens of new sites. He believes they migrated peacefully into Canaan.
We're looking now backward on Wadi Farah. I believe that along this road, the Israelites has entered from the Jordan that we can see on the opening, and gradually entered and penetrated into the sedentary life, into the land of the Promised Land. Now we know that these Israelites were half nomads, and they moved gradually into sedentary, settled life.
Zertal is convinced that the Israelites were originally nomads who came across the Jordan River and settled around Wadi Farah, the only perennial source of water in the region. Here they could live on the land and graze their flocks year-round. Eventually, they gave up their traditional nomadic tents for more permanent structures, like these crude mud huts unique to Wadi Farah.
I think in a very firm way that they were foreigners who came from the other side of the Jordan. They were not Canaanites, since they were not directed from the Canaanite city-states to this land, but vice versa.
Although Zertal has discarded the conquest theory in favor of his peaceful migration theory, he is equally passionate about a new discovery.
We were digging here without understanding what it was. We didn't even dare to dream that we deal here with Joshua's altar.
He believes he has found the altar built by Joshua at Mount Ebal after the Israelites reached the Promised Land.
That was a moment I'll never forget until the last day of my life. We couldn't sleep for a couple of nights, because then it was a very good proof that we deal here with a real first Israelite altar, where our people has started the real roots of everything, not only of the Jewish culture, but probably of all the Western civilization. I still can remember this enthusiasm and this excitement, I think, never to be repeated in my lifetime.
However, not everyone agrees with Zertal.
Well, Mount Ebal may be a cult site, but the altar, as far as I'm concerned, is Zertal's sheer imagination.
Israel Finkelstein has proposed yet another new theory for the origin of the Israelites. Convinced that they were not immigrants, Finkelstein argues that many were probably Canaanites, as were their fathers and their fathers before them.
I think that the Israelites were probably local people who were probably sedentary people in the middle of the second millennium. Then there was a collapse of the urban culture, there was a process of nomadization, and after a few centuries, a resedentarization. They were Canaanites because they lived in Canaan of the second millennium BC.
And for Amichai Mazar, clues that the Israelites emerged from Canaan sometimes come from unsuspected sources.
This little bronze bull was found by me in a kibbutz antiquities collection. It was found by a soldier training in the northern Samaria mountains, not far from Shechem, north of Shechem, biblical Shechem. It was found on a remote mountain, and I was shown the place exactly where it was found. We excavated there, and we could date it to this time, the 12th century BC, the period of the Israelite settlement. And we believe that the place where this bull was found was a high place. That means it was a sanctuary, an open-air sanctuary, utilized by those Israelites in the early phase of their settlement there. Now, this is a very interesting find, because we know that the Canaanites, much earlier, also used or had in their sanctuaries bronze bulls made in a very similar fashion. So we can claim that this little bull illustrates Canaanite traditions and inspiration on the early Israelite religion and cult.
If the Israelites were Canaanites all along, when did they emerge as a unified people with a cultural identity?
You cannot just ask who are the Israelites, because you must also be specific about a time in history. Under Joshua, or in the period described in the book of Joshua, did they know that they were Israelites? We don't know. We don't have enough historical evidence for this. But obviously many people who joined in this new force were local or were from here, and it was a mixture of people, you see.
Whether or not they identify themselves as Israelites, this mixture of people was somehow different. In the archaeological layers of Hatzor, the settlement after the Great Fire is quite distinct from its Canaanite predecessors.
So we have something different. Is this something different, Israelite or not? For the time being, I think it is, but for the time being, we don't have an absolute proof. We need something else which I don't know if we shall ever find. Maybe we need a lot more of the same. But I think these are the Israelites. And it's a different page in a different story.
The Old Testament contains a second version of the conquest that contradicts the book of Joshua. In the book of Judges, the Israelites dwelled side by side with the Canaanites until a crisis threatened to overwhelm them. The world was turned upside down.
Around 1200 BC, a crisis burst throughout the ancient Near East. Many cities collapsed. The empires collapsed. The Hittite Empire, the Egyptian Empire. After 1150 BC, the Egyptian Empire did not survive anymore. And many of those Canaanite city-states, Canaanite cities, for example, the largest, the most well-known one is Hatzor in the Galilee, disappeared. They just ceased to exist.
In fact, the world as they knew it ceased to exist. A golden age of trade and prosperity had linked Canaan to the empires of the Mediterranean and the Aegean. When they collapsed, the social, economic, and political fabric of the Canaanite city-states collapsed with them. Today, most archaeologists agree that against this backdrop of turmoil and unrest, small groups of shepherds and herders, now politically independent and economically self-reliant, wandered into the isolated hills of Canaan to begin a new life. Out of their experience slowly emerged a new culture and a new identity. In time, they would become known as the Israelites. Does this new theory, based on decades of archaeological research, mean the Bible is wrong? Does it diminish the legend that has sustained Israel for centuries? Perhaps it puts it in perspective.
We have to understand that the Bible is not a source for describing the origin of Israel, for the simple reason that the biblical narrative was compiled at least, or even written in Jerusalem in the 7th century BC. And in many ways it reflects the ideas, the ideology, the economic affairs, the political affairs of the people of Jerusalem in the 7th century, which means 5 centuries after the supposed events took place.
It's a question of how you look on the Bible. There are many points of view on the Bible. Of course, fundamentalists, both Christians and Orthodox Jews, believe in the Bible as the Word of God, and they accept its history as the true history. On the other hand, we have ultra-critical scholars, starting in the late 19th century and up to our own days, who claim that much of the biblical narrative is just literary fiction.
Archaeology is not here to prove or disprove the Bible. I mean, the Bible, as a book written in divine inspiration, needs no proof.
Professor Avram Beran is a veteran archaeologist who began excavating in Israel before it became a state. He now teaches biblical archaeology at Hebrew Union College in Jerusalem.
Take Jericho. How many articles and books have been written? Did the walls of Jericho came falling down? Now, I don't know if it really matters. There must have been some kind of a historical element in the story, but we don't know which of the layers of occupation of Jericho can be ascribed to it. We don't know when it took place exactly. But to me, the myth of Jericho, if you like, has sustained the Israelites and the Jewish people for thousands of years.
But for Adam Zertal, each chapter and verse of the Old Testament is incontestably etched in these stones.
The debate cannot be whether the Israelites were Israelites, because the Israelite entity here is quite clear by, as I said, the similarity with the Bible and the later Jewish temple in Jerusalem.
In the Holy Land, biblical archaeology often reflects modern longings as much as ancient truths.
How does archaeology, how does material culture relate to the biblical narratives? And here, this is a question of what's important. You cannot answer it in general. You have to say, for whom? There are some people who need, for one reason or another, to have 100% correlation between archaeology and the biblical narrative, in order to prove or to give them confidence or to give them a sense of identity, to give them roots in history. For a dozen different reasons, people need to have 100% correlation. Others, I'd say, like me, I don't need 100% correlation. I don't need to read a chapter in the Bible and then run to the field and see, can I find something which relates to this or not? My identity as an Israeli, I don't think it has anything to do with one theory or another in the book of Joshua. For some it is important, for others it's not.
And in the larger perspective, archaeology perhaps serves the needs of a nation over time.
When I was brought up 30 years ago in the education system in Israel, I was brought up on the narrative of the conquest of Canaan and destroying the local people and so on. And I'm not sure that this is the way that we have to look at things today. It's important for us, I think, in Israel, for the way that we shape our culture and our identity today, in the sense that it teaches us, I think, to find a way to live with our neighbors.
In the present-day turmoil of the Middle East, archaeology has shed new light on this ancient landscape. Far from shattering a myth, it has enriched an epic tale of struggle and survival that continues to rock the political landscape of Israel today. In an earlier time, the suggestion that the Israelites were themselves Canaanites would have earned its author a public stoning. Yet in the timeless interplay of science and religion, one era's heresy is often another's article of faith. Perhaps tomorrow, the idea of the Israelites as Canaanites will be no more earth-shaking than the theory of evolution.
Well, here we have maybe an unholy trinity, okay? There's archaeology, there is Bible, there is politics.
Which thus became the Holy Grail. Joseph of Arimathea fled Roman persecution to England. Landing at St. Michael's Mount, he took the Holy Grail as a talisman to found the first Christian church in the British Isles. The story then took a curious turn. The Holy Grail was somehow lost. 500 years later, the legend continued with the birth of King Arthur. On the wind-swept rocky Cornish coast, beneath the ruins of the great castle of Tintagel, lies Merlin's cave. Around 500 AD, the old magician, deep in thought, left his grotto. Old King Uther Pendragon was dying without an heir, and the future of England seemed in grave doubt. He found an abandoned baby and recognized that this was an auspicious moment. England needed a strong ruler and a common goal. Merlin proclaimed to the skies, "England, behold your king." So the story was told. The baby did grow up to unite all the warring feudal barons. Arthur's Order of the Round Table was the first stirring of democracy in medieval Europe. Late one night, near the end of Arthur's reign, a strange omen appeared to the Round Table. Jousting, questing, bringing chivalry to medieval England. At the heart of the Arthur stories was a mystery, a strange, otherworldly quest for the long-lost Holy Grail. There are 47 surviving romances of King Arthur and the quest for the Holy Grail. Arthur was a real person. In the 5th century, he led the Britons to a decisive victory over the Saxons. The Grail legends, however, are not history, but a very strange intertwining of Christian and pagan stories.
For the first time on In Search Of, we're going to examine the same mystery twice. First, as a Christian legend, and second, as a very ancient pagan myth.
The image of the Last Supper derives from medieval art. The events are chronicled in the Gospels. Jerusalem, 33 AD. 13 humble Jews gathered to celebrate Passover, a ritual unchanged since the time of Moses. Their rabbi, Jesus, astounded the group with his blessing of the ritual wine. Drink. This is my blood, spilled for the redemption of sin. We will not drink again of this fruit of the vine until we all meet in heaven. A day later, Jesus was dying on the cross. According to legend, Joseph of Arimathea attended the crucifixion. He anointed with Christ's blood the same silver chalice the most elusive holy relic of all time. Was it the chalice Jesus used to celebrate the Last Supper? Was it a magic vessel found again in Arthurian times? From the Holy Land to pagan Britain to the New World, In Search Of has tracked this mystery. What was the Holy Grail? Modern films and novels still celebrate King Arthur and the